Now's the time for the message. One day, a little girl was sitting watching her mother as her mother did the dishes at the kitchen sink. She suddenly notices that her mother has several strands of white hair sticking out in really deep contrast to the dark brown hair that is most of over her head. So she looks at her mother. She asks, "Why are some of your hairs white, Mom?" Mother replied, "Well, every time you do something wrong and make me cry or unhappy, one of my hairs turns gray." The little girl thought about this for a while, pondered over it. Finally, she asked, "Mama, how come all of Grandma's hairs are gray?" Now, I don't know if that story points more to the stresses of motherhood or to this mother's mastery of the guilt trip. But guilt is only one way of many ways moms and other people as well have to encourage desired behavior. Christian psychologist Paul Tournier says that guilt may be appropriate or it may be inappropriate. So, blaming graying hair on the behavior of a child, what do you think? Is that appropriate or inappropriate? Think about it. The goal today, now that I've started an argument for you guys later on, is to uplift motherhood. Where would humanity be without it? Where would we be without our mothers? I think it true that everyone sitting here today, every single one of us, has a birth mother. Unless they're not teaching that in biology class anymore. I don't know. Motherhood deserves more than just one day of recognition every year. But here we are today, and this is the day. So we're going to uplift motherhood. If you hear nothing else today of what I say, hear the value and the blessing of motherhood. Now, I know in going into this that I'm not the most qualified to be uplifting motherhood. I have no firsthand experience of what it is to bear, birth, and raise a child. My experience is the only way that males can draw so close to heavenly recreation, and that is by proxy. I was able to be there while my beautiful wife did the heavy lifting, and it wasn't easy all the time. Motherhood is not easy. Tina Fey's quoted on her experience of motherhood that she's never been so tired, and she's also never been so happy. Motherhood is multifaceted. It's biological. It's also spiritual. Motherhood, according to one dictionary, may be a noun, a verb, or an adjective. As a noun, true only for the fact of having given birth. But motherhood is also defined as a verb, having qualities or the spirit of a mother. Any one of us can mother a child in the verb sense, referring to how you relate to the child in comfort and nurture. The definition of motherhood I like the best is the adjective. It's a description relating to an inherent worthiness, justness, or goodness that is obvious or unarguable. Now, the first descriptive word I see here is the word unarguable. You can't argue with mother, right? Well, you can, but it may not be pretty. Shortly after my daughter married, a disagreement arose between my daughter and her husband. And the subject was a minor subject. Does it really matter if a woman has more handbags than she could ever use? Mother-in-law entered into the disagreement. So in an effort to balance the field, my son-in-law appealed to me. You agree with me, don't you? I thought about it briefly, then calmly turned to my son-in-law and said, you're not going to win. The rightness of mother, even mother-in-law, is obvious and not arguable. The descriptive of motherhood, relating to an inherent worthiness, justness, or goodness that is obvious or unarguable. The inherent worth of motherhood to society should be obvious. Where would we be without mothers? In the movie Hook, Hook is a remake of the Peter Pan movie, the Peter Pan story. The young mistress Maggie Banning shows wisdom beyond her years when she begs her father, Peter, to let go of the feud with Captain Hook. She says, he's just a mean old man without a mommy. Where would we be? Where could we be without mothers and mommies? There are studies that point to the truth which should be obvious. Children thrive best when they have a loving relationship with their biological mother. From a Kansas State University child development expert, this expert says in his study that a mother has different relationship with her kids than a father. And I think a lot of that is based on biological connection. We don't fully understand the power of that connection. Now, not everyone would agree with that, but it makes sense to me. The relationship and bond between a child and mother begins at conception, as the baby grows and begins its journey on earth in the womb. That connection is formed from the very beginning. One mom says, I knew my life had been invaded by God in a way which I would never be the same. But reality always invades. Reality is unfortunate in that not all children get to be raised by their biological parents. We need not look beyond the life of Jesus Christ to have a conversation about that. Joseph and Mary took responsibility to raise Jesus, not just to let him grow up, but to raise him in love. And the point here is that life is not always perfect. But that shouldn't stop us from reaching for that high bar of living and to recognize the need for motherhood. A recent news public interest article caught my attention just this past week. A 19-year-old, an adult in Florida, was adopted by the woman who had been her foster parent since she had been 11 years old. So even adults, even this 19-year-old, needed that identity and needed to have a mother to be able to point to someone and say, this is my mother, in order to fill a need inside of self. There's a need of a spirit of mother to be close to us. American psychologist Harry Harlow has studied the nurture that infants need and concludes that young ones need a comforting mother. And if a real mom isn't available in this study, then he says a surrogate will do. The point is that we all need that connection to inherent worthiness, justice, and goodness that is embodied in motherhood. Within the Gospel of John, we have the words of Jesus describing the relationship between himself and his disciples. The qualities that we uphold for motherhood are also seen in the Jesus relationship, and it doesn't matter if you're male or female. Relationship with Jesus has these qualities. I think motherhood inherently and naturally draws the mother closer to God and to godliness than is possible for any other estate of being. If we follow Jesus, though, we can all nurture those qualities in ourselves. For the smart man, woman brings him closer to God than his natural tendencies could ever bring him on his own. What has not become obvious, I think, in today's society is that within a model of one man, one woman in committed relationship, that the fullness of God's promise of lasting fruit can be had. Ultimately, childbearing, child rearing is not about the adult coming closer to God, but it is about the child being given life and about giving the child the best chance for a blessed life that can be given. And that's the same as the relationship is between Jesus and his disciples. Jesus said, I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last. We see in Jesus qualities that reflect what many would uphold as being just and good. These are the same qualities of motherhood. First, a mother lays down her life for her child. Jesus modeled this love. And he said in verse 13 of today's scripture, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends or one's child. Just as love can refer to different kinds of love, we can have eros, phileo, agape love. Just as love can refer to different kinds of love, the concept of friendship that Jesus refers to in John can also have different meaning, different levels of friendship. Aristotle defines 3 levels. Pleasure is the first level of friendship, utility, and the third is character. Character, the last one, being the only model of friendship that can turn into a truly great relationship. One that is, and I'll quote an article about Aristotle, quote, an amazing, selfless, meaningful bond, end quote. An amazing, selfless, meaningful bond is what Jesus shared with his disciples. It is what Jesus shares with his believers even today. And it's what mothers share with their children. About 100 years ago, a young mother was making her way across the hills of South Wales, carrying her tiny baby in her arms, when she was overtaken by a blinding blizzard. She never reached her destination. When the blizzard had subsided, her body was found by searchers beneath a mound of snow. They discovered that before her death, she had taken off all her outer clothing and wrapped it around her baby. When they unwrapped the child, to their great surprise and joy, they found he was alive and well. She had mounted her body over his and given her life for her child, proving the depths of a mother's love. Years later, that child, David Lloyd George, grown into manhood, became Prime Minister of Great Britain. You never know what you're going to get. Giving up one's life for another is not always so dramatic. It might happen in the cold of winter. It might be on a cross. But giving up one's life for another is not always a matter of death. One of the things the U.S. Census Bureau tracks is employment. They report that since the beginning of COVID, they say around 10 million mothers in the United States living with their own school-age children were not actively working this past January. 1.4 million more than during the same month last year. And the Census Bureau draws the conclusion then that working mothers are either willingly leaving jobs or they're being forced out in extraordinary numbers. Mothers' V-shaped employment patterns are becoming prolonged and more severe in this global crisis. The V-shaped employment pattern of mothers. This slide kind of shows in the red scale a mother's employment pattern. On the bottom is, going across the bottom is her age, and the vertical row then is how many moms are employed. It's a V-shaped pattern in the red there in the middle for most mothers. It's always been. Young women will enter the workforce as young women and then take time off when the stork comes so that they can take care of the children, creating a V pattern in a time frame of their work career. Now, not all women do this and have a V pattern work timeline. Not all can take off from work. Not all want to either, and that's fine. For those who can't, it's probably because food and shelter remain necessities, no matter what the other circumstances of life might be. Yet there are a significant number of women who are fortunate to make motherhood and homemaker their only work. And I ask this morning, isn't that enough? After all, where would we be without mothers? This truth, that mothers have a different workforce experience than those who are not mothers, this truth is also that mothers have a different life experience. Just the fact of being a mother gives them a different life experience. In the dilemma of motherhood, for me, and again, I'm not the most qualified, but for me, that dilemma moves me to a belief that motherhood draws a woman closer to Jesus and to godliness than men can ever hope. And that's okay. Different experiences in life are okay. Life is not the same for everyone. The second of qualities that reflect what many would uphold as being just and good is reflected in verse 15 of today's scripture. A mother teaches so that there comes a time when her children know right from wrong. They are taught how to function in life. Jesus said to his disciples, I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. The rules along the way, the nurturing, the guilt trips, and perhaps the discipline should be about making children into functioning adults. The qualities of motherhood relating to an inherent worthiness, justice, or goodness that is obvious or unarguable really should not cross the line into self-serving manipulation, into inappropriate guilt on the mother's part. But where the desire is to encourage that child to be the best that they can be, there motherhood and Jesus are in sync and are synonymous. A third quality that is reflected in today's gospel is about a mother's love. Verse 17. This is Jesus' command, that you love one another. A mother's love for her child is the purest love a human can experience. And I think that's all we need to say about that. A fourth and a last quality of a Christian mother for today that emanates and flows forth from love, I think, can be found in our Timothy verses. Timothy was influenced and brought up in the faith by his grandmother and by his mother. Paul says in Timothy, I am reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. Mothers bless their children when they pass down their faith. And if a mother is blessed, her children become people of faith. When Robert Ingersoll, a skeptic of faith, was in his heyday, 2 college students went to hear him lecture. After the lecture, one said to the other, "Well, I guess he knocked the props out from under Christianity, didn't he?" The other student said, "No, I don't think he did. Ingersoll did not explain my mother's life. And until he can explain my mother's life, I will stand by my mother's God." Proverbs, her children arise and call her blessed. Where would we be without our mothers? We would be that much further away, I think, from pure love. We would be that much further away from Jesus and his love. So appreciate your moms. Let them know that you love them more than just one day out of each year.